Hey, it's Creep. Before we start, drop a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to know who's awake with me in the dark. All right, let's get into our first story. I need to get this down while I still can, while my hands still work, while I can still feel them. 3 weeks ago, I moved into a house in rural West Virginia, about 40 minutes south of Morgantown, tucked against the base of a limestone ridge that the locals just called the Shelf. The house had been empty for 6 years. We got it through a government auction for a price that should have made me suspicious, but all I saw was opportunity. My wife, Lauren, had been in Michigan helping her mother recover from hip surgery, so I handled the purchase, the inspection, the movers, all of it. She trusted me. I wish she hadn't. The plan was simple. I'd get the house set up. She'd fly in a week later, and we'd start our life out here, away from the noise and the rent and the slow suffocation of the city. I had our dog with me, a border collie named Rook, and between the two of us, I figured we'd be fine on our own for a few days. The first thing that struck me when I pulled into the gravel drive was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, absent quiet. No birds. No insects. Just wind scraping through the brush and the low groan of the house settling against the hillside. Rook didn't want to get out of the truck. He sat in the passenger seat with his ears pinned back, staring at the front door like it owed him money. I had to carry him out. Inside, the place smelled like something between a library and a cellar. Old paper, damp wood, and a mineral tang I couldn't place. The movers had done a decent job with the furniture, though everything felt slightly wrong, the way a hotel room feels when you first walk in. Close to home, but not home. Not yet. The floors were original hardwood, scuffed and groaning under every step. The walls had been repainted at some point in the last decade, a flat, institutional off-white that made the rooms feel like they were holding their breath. The ceilings were high, which should have made the space feel open, but somehow the shadows up there just made everything feel taller and emptier. I spent that first afternoon unpacking boxes and getting the kitchen functional. Rook followed me from room to room, which wasn't unusual. He was always glued to my side, but his body language was off. He kept pausing in hallways, lifting his head, sniffing at things I couldn't see. Every now and then he'd let out a low whine, the kind he usually saved for thunderstorms. It was around 6 in the evening when I noticed the wall. The house had a narrow hallway connecting the front foyer to the kitchen, with the staircase branching off to the left. Halfway down that hall, Rook stopped dead. He planted his front paws and stared at a section of the wall to his right, about chest height on me. Then he started growling. Not his playful growl, not his warning bark. A deep, vibrating rumble that I'd only heard once before, the night a black bear had wandered onto the porch of our old rental. I crouched next to him, running my hand along the wall. The surface looked normal, painted drywall, same off-white as the rest of the hall. But under my fingers I felt a seam, a rectangular outline, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, that had been papered over and painted. I pressed on the center and felt it give slightly, like there was empty space behind it. Rook backed away from me as I explored the outline, his growl never stopping. When I pulled my hand away, the faintest trace of moisture was on my fingertips. I rubbed them together and felt nothing unusual, but I wiped them on my jeans anyway. Something about the dampness felt wrong, too cold, like it had come from deep underground. I called Lauren that night and mentioned it. She told me to call the realtor, but I did one better. I dug out the inspection report. Buried in the notes was a single line I'd glossed over during the chaos of buying. Previous dumbwaiter shaft, sealed at both levels. Connects to former root cellar. No access. No hazard. A dumbwaiter. One of those little cargo elevators old houses used to have for moving food and firewood between floors. This one apparently went down into some kind of underground storage space that had been built into the limestone. The report said it was sealed. The inspector had signed off. I told myself it was nothing. Rook didn't agree. That first night, he refused to walk past that section of hallway. He'd go the long way around, through the living room and into the kitchen through the side entrance, rather than take the direct path. I thought he was being dramatic. Border collies are smart, but they're also neurotic. I let it go. I woke up at 2:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I looked at my phone immediately, the way you do when something pulls you out of sleep and your brain needs a number to hold on to. Rook was standing on the bed, not lying, not sitting, standing rigid as a statue, facing the bedroom door. The hair along his spine was raised in a solid line from his neck to his tail. He was making a sound I had never heard from him before, a rapid, shallow panting interspersed with that same deep growl. It sounded mechanical, almost, like an engine trying to turn over. Then I heard it, a rapid thumping from downstairs. Not footsteps exactly, more like someone drumming all 10 fingers on a table, but louder and moving. The sound traveled from the kitchen to the foyer in about 2 seconds, a skittering patter that was too fast for anything with 2 legs. I sat up. Rook looked at me. I swear, in the dim glow from the hallway nightlight, he looked at me like he was asking what I was going to do about this. I grabbed the aluminum baseball bat from under the bed. Lauren had insisted I keep it there. She grew up in a rough neighborhood and old habits die hard. I'd rolled my eyes at the time. I wasn't rolling them now. The thumping continued. It moved through the first floor in bursts. A few seconds of that rapid, skittering patter. Then silence. Then it would start again somewhere else. Kitchen. Living room. Foyer. Back to the kitchen. Whatever was down there was fast. I told Rook to stay. He didn't listen. He followed me to the top of the stairs, then stopped at the landing and sat down, whimpering. That scared me more than the noise. This was a dog who had once chased a coyote out of our yard without hesitation. Whatever was down there, he didn't want any part of it. I went down alone, step by step, keeping to the edges where the wood was less likely to creak. The thumping had stopped by the time I reached the bottom, but the front door was wide open. Cold November air was pouring in, carrying that same mineral smell, stronger now. I checked every room on the first floor. Nothing. No signs of entry. No muddy footprints. no damage. Just the open door and a silence so complete it made my ears ring. I locked the door, deadbolt and chain, and checked every window. All secured. I was about to head back upstairs when Rook started barking. Not at me, at something above him. He was at the top of the stairs, backing away from the second-floor landing, barking with a ferocity that shook his whole body. The thumping was back, but it wasn't downstairs anymore. It was directly above me, on the second floor, moving between the bedrooms with that same impossible speed, a dozen tiny impacts per second, like something with far too many legs was sprinting across the hardwood. I took the stairs 3 at a time. I hit the landing, bat raised, and charged into the master bedroom. Empty, untouched. The closet doors were closed. The windows were locked. Even the goddamn throw pillows were still arranged the way I'd left them. I checked every room. Nothing. Rook had retreated to the bathroom and wedged himself between the toilet and the wall, shaking. I sat on the floor next to him, my hand on his back, and we stayed like that until the sun came up. The next morning, I was sitting on the front porch drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid when a kid came walking up the gravel path. Couldn't have been older than 22, 23. Skinny, wearing a faded university hoodie, carrying a backpack that looked like it weighed more than he did. He introduced himself as Caleb Marsh, a graduate student from WVU doing field research on some kind of salamander species in the streams around the property. Apparently, he'd been coming out here for months while the house was empty. He showed me photos on his phone, these pale, eyeless little things, barely 2 inches long, the color of wet concrete. They looked like something that had never seen sunlight, which, he explained, was exactly the case. They're a subterranean species, he said, practically vibrating with enthusiasm. They're washing out of the limestone cave system that runs under this whole ridge. I've only been finding juveniles, EFTs, in the streams. The adults have to be further in, but I can't access the caves from outside. The openings are too narrow. He paused, looking at the house. A lot of these old properties were built directly over cave entrances. Some of them even had passages connecting basements and cellars to the cave system for cold storage. I don't suppose this house has anything like that. I thought about the sealed dumbwaiter, the root cellar beneath it, the line in the inspection report. No access, no hazard. No, I said. Nothing like that. He thanked me, said he'd stick to the streams, and headed off toward the ridge. I watched him go, then looked down at Rook, who was lying on the porch with his head between his paws, staring at the front door the same way he'd been staring at it since we arrived. The second night was worse. I'd bought extra locks at the hardware store in town, a new deadbolt for the front, slide bolts for the back door. The cashier, a heavy-set woman who looked like she'd lived in the area her whole life, had glanced at the pile of hardware on her counter and asked if everything was okay. I told her raccoons. She'd looked at me for a beat too long before scanning the items. On the drive back, I passed 2 other houses that sat along the same ridge. Both abandoned. Both dark. I realized I hadn't seen a single neighbor since I'd arrived. Back at the house, I installed everything. I'd checked every window twice. I'd left lights on downstairs. I'd even moved a bookshelf in front of the dumbwaiter panel, figuring if something was using it, I'd hear the furniture move. None of it mattered. At 1:47, Rook woke me up again. Same posture, same sound, same rigid stance on the bed. But this time, the thumping didn't start from the kitchen. It started from the hallway wall, from behind the dumbwaiter. A steady, rhythmic pounding, like something testing the barrier. Thump, thump, thump. Then a pause, then faster. Thump, 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 thump. The sound of the bookshelf scraping an inch across the floor. I was on my feet before I fully understood what I was hearing. I got to the top of the stairs and looked down. The hallway light was on, and I could see the bookshelf had been pushed about 6 inches away from the wall. The paper covering the dumbwaiter panel was torn, not pulled or peeled, torn outward in ragged strips, like something had punched through from the other side. Rook was behind me, pressed against my legs, shaking so hard I could feel it through my jeans. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for the thumping to stop. Long enough for the silence to feel worse than the noise. I went downstairs. The bookshelf had been moved, books scattered across the floor. The dumbwaiter panel was partially exposed. Old wood, dark with age, held in place by a latch that was rusted but intact. The latch was bent. Something had been pushing against it from the inside, but the panel was still closed. Whatever had been trying to get out hadn't managed it, yet. I pushed the bookshelf back against the wall, then wedged a kitchen chair under it for good measure. I checked the rest of the house. Nothing disturbed, nothing moved. But in the kitchen, on the handle of the refrigerator, I found something that made the hair on my arms stand up. A thin layer of slime. Clear, viscous, slightly tacky to the touch. I wiped it on a dish towel and immediately wished I hadn't. My fingers went numb. Not cold numb, not pins and needles. Dead numb, like the nerves had been switched off. It took almost an hour for the feeling to come back. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the living room with the bat across my knees and Rook on the couch next to me, and I waited for morning. The next day, I did what I should have done from the beginning. I pulled the bookshelf away from the wall for good, grabbed a pry bar from the garage, and forced the dumbwaiter panel open. The shaft behind it was about 3 feet square, lined with old timber that had gone black with moisture. A set of frayed ropes hung in the center, connected to a wooden platform that was jammed about halfway down. Below the platform, the shaft continued into darkness. The smell that came up from it hit me like a physical force. That same mineral tang, multiplied by 100, mixed with something organic, something alive. I pointed my phone's flashlight down the shaft. The platform blocked most of my view, but through gaps in the rotting wood, I could see the shaft continue down at least another 15 feet before opening into a wider space, the root cellar, and beyond that, nothing but black. The flashlight beam didn't bounce back. It just vanished into a darkness so complete that it felt solid, like a wall made of nothing. Cold air drifted up from below in a steady current, carrying that mineral stench and something else underneath it. A faint, organic sweetness, like rotting vegetation, or rotting meat. I couldn't tell which. The walls of the shaft below the platform were streaked with slime. Wide, glistening trails of it, layered over one another, some still wet. And in the slime, I could see marks, scratches. Tiny, parallel grooves in the wood, clustered together, like something had been climbing the walls using dozens of small, sharp points. I closed the panel and nailed it shut. 8 nails, driven in as deep as I could get them. Then I pushed the bookshelf back and the chair and pulled the kitchen table into the hallway and shoved it against all of it. I called Lauren that afternoon and told her not to come. I didn't explain why, not fully. I just said there was a problem with the house and I was handling it. She could hear it in my voice. She always could, but she didn't push. I told her I'd call back that evening. I should have left. I know that now. But the thing is, I didn't fully understand yet what I was dealing with. Raccoons, I thought. Some kind of animal that had been living in the cave system and found its way up through the shaft, the slime, the numbness. Maybe it was some kind of fungal growth. There are caves in West Virginia that have all sorts of biological strangeness in them. I could get an exterminator. I could seal the shaft with concrete. I could fix this. That's what I told myself. That's the lie that kept me in that house one more night. You always think you can fix it. You always think the rational explanation is the right one, because the alternative is something your brain simply refuses to process. I was wrong about all of it. The third night, I almost didn't go to sleep. I sat in the living room until midnight, every light in the house burning. Rook curled up on the couch beside me. He'd barely eaten that day. He'd barely left my side. When I finally went upstairs, I brought him with me, closed the bedroom door, and pushed the dresser against it. I woke to Rook screaming. I don't know how else to describe the sound a dog makes when he's beyond fear, beyond warning, when every instinct in his body is telling him that something fundamentally wrong is close. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a howl. It was a shriek, high and ragged, and it launched me out of bed so fast I knocked my glasses off the nightstand. The thumping was everywhere, above me, below me, inside the walls. That rapid, skittering patter. But now it wasn't just one source. It was multiple. 3, 4, maybe more, moving through the house in chaotic patterns, up and down the stairs, across the ceilings. I could hear the plaster cracking overhead. Rook bolted. The dresser wasn't fully blocking the door. He hit it at full speed, knocked it aside enough to squeeze through, and he was gone. I heard his claws on the stairs, then frantic barking from somewhere on the first floor. I grabbed the bat and went after him. The hallway was a mess. The kitchen table had been overturned. The bookshelf was on its side, books everywhere. The dumbwaiter panel was wide open, hanging by one splintered hinge. The nails I'd driven in bent outward like flower petals. The shaft breathed cold, wet air into the hallway, and the smell was overpowering. I turned toward the kitchen. The thumping was in there, accompanied by the sound of things being knocked over, the crash of plates, the wet slap of food hitting the floor. I raised the bat and stepped through the doorway. It was on the ceiling, 6 feet long, maybe more. A body like a massive salamander, smooth and gray and glistening, pressed flat against the plaster with limbs that were too thin and too many. Its skin had the same colorless quality as the EFTs in the researchers' photos, but scaled up to something that should not exist. 2 enormous black spots dominated its head. Not eyes, or maybe eyes that had evolved so far past seeing that they'd become something else. A mouth opened beneath them, wide and flat, and I could see rows of small, inward curving teeth lining the roof of its mouth, designed for gripping, for holding, for pulling things in. It moved before I could. 1 second it was on the ceiling. The next it was flowing down the wall like water, hitting the floor with a wet smack and barreling toward me on those tiny, rapid legs. The thumping sound, it was the legs. Dozens of them, drumming against whatever surface it clung to. I swung. The bat connected with the side of its head, and the thing made a sound like air being let out of a tire, a long whistling hiss. I swung again and again, driving it back toward the kitchen counter. It reared up, mouth gaping, and I brought the bat down on its skull with everything I had. I felt the bone give way. It collapsed, twitching, leaking dark fluid that smelled like the inside of a cave. For 3 seconds, I thought I'd won. Then I heard the thumping from the foyer, and from the living room, and from the top of the stairs. I stepped out of the kitchen. The front door was open again. I have no idea how. The deadbolt was thrown. The chain was on, but it was open, and 2 more of those things were already inside. One was on the wall next to the door, clutching the surface with those impossible limbs, the remains of something small and furred dangling from its jaws. The other was on the ceiling of the foyer, directly above me, watching with those flat black circles on its face. From behind me, I heard the dumbwaiter shaft creak. I turned just enough to see a 4th one pulling itself up out of the opening, its slime-covered body squeezing through the frame, limbs finding purchase on the hallway wall. They hadn't come from outside to get in. They'd already been inside, beneath me, beneath the house, this whole time. The dumbwaiter shaft wasn't a forgotten relic. It was a passage, a highway between their world and mine, and I'd been sleeping above it for 3 nights, separated by a few inches of old wood and a coat of paint. Rook was barking somewhere, the living room maybe, but the sound was getting farther away. I prayed he'd gotten out the open door. I prayed he was running down that gravel path and wouldn't stop until he hit the highway. He was smart. He was fast. He'd make it. He had to make it. I backed into the kitchen. The dead one was still on the floor. The 4 living ones moved closer, not rushing, not charging, crawling, patient, like they knew I had nowhere to go. The numbness in my hand from 2 nights ago hadn't fully faded, and now my grip on the bat was failing. I looked at the kitchen window. It was my only option. I raised the bat to break the glass. They all moved at once. Caleb Marsh arrived at the property just after dawn, as he had every morning for the past week. The early hours were the best time to check his EFT traps in the stream, when the water temperature was lowest and the specimens were most active. He noticed the front door of the house was open. Not unusual for a rural property in the morning, maybe. But Mrs. Dellen's husband had seemed like the cautious type. He walked closer and called out, no answer. The border collie he'd seen through the window the day before was nowhere in sight. He would have left it alone. It wasn't his business. But something in the stream that morning had changed his plans. Alongside the usual half-dead EFs, he'd found something larger. An adult specimen, almost 8 inches long, the first confirmed adult of the species he'd spent months trying to document. It was injured, its head partially crushed, leaking fluid into the water. It must have been swept downstream from somewhere inside the ridge. He needed to ask about the caves. He needed access to whatever was under this house. He stepped onto the porch and looked through the open door. The hallway was a mess. Furniture overturned, books scattered, a wooden panel in the wall hanging open to reveal a dark shaft that smelled like the inside of the earth. He called out again. Nothing. Then, in the stream behind him, something else washed out from the hillside. He turned and saw it catch against the rocks where his traps were set. A torn, bloodied shirt, heavy with viscous slime, turning slowly in the shallow water. Caleb Marsh stood very still for a very long time. Then he looked back at the dark opening in the hallway wall, and he began to understand what the adults of the species looked like. He just didn't yet understand how big they could get. And somewhere beyond the ridge, on the shoulder of a 2-lane highway 3 miles from the nearest house, a border collie ran south with his ears pinned flat, not stopping, not looking back, carrying in his animal brain the only complete account of what lived under the shelf. I still drive past the turnoff for my father's ranch sometimes. Not on purpose. There's no other route between Crestwood and the interstate. But every time I see that crooked wooden post where the mailbox used to be, my hands tighten on the wheel and something cold settles behind my ribs. It's been 2 years now. The property sold to a cattle company out of Bozeman, and they tore down the old house, put up a prefab steel barn, and ran fence lines through what used to be the front yard. There's nothing left of the place I grew up. Nothing you could see anyway. But I need to tell this story. I've carried it alone long enough, and some nights it presses against the inside of my skull like it wants out. I've tried telling bits of it, to a friend over drinks once, to a therapist who nodded politely and steered the conversation toward grief processing. Nobody hears the real thing underneath. They hear a man struggling with the loss of his father. And maybe that's part of it. But it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is stranger and darker and more beautiful than anything I know how to explain in casual conversation. So here it is. Everything that happened the weekend I went back to clean out my father's things. The weekend I almost didn't come home. My father died on a Tuesday in November. Heart attack, they said. Found him in his recliner with the television still on. A glass of water on the side table. 1 boot off and 1 boot on. Like he'd been getting ready to call it a night and his body just decided to quit. He was 68. Not ancient, not young. Just a man whose heart had been working overtime since my mother left when I was 11. And who never once slowed down enough to let it rest. The funeral was small, a handful of neighbors, his buddy Ernie from the feed store, my cousin Donna, who flew in from Tucson. I stood at the graveside in a suit I'd bought that morning because I didn't own one, and I felt nothing. Not grief, not relief, not anger. Just a flat, gray absence, like someone had scooped out the center of me and left the shell standing. The grief came later. It always does. 3 weeks after the burial, I drove up to the ranch to start packing his things. The plan was simple. Spend the weekend boxing up whatever was worth keeping, haul the rest to the dump, get the house ready for the realtor. I figured 2 days, maybe 3. I'd sleep in my old bedroom, eat whatever I could heat up on the stove, and be back in the city by Monday morning. That was the plan. I arrived around 6 in the evening, just as the last streaks of copper were draining out of the sky behind the mountains. The ranch sat at the end of a 7-mile dirt road that wound through dense pine forest before opening into a wide meadow. The house was a 1-story log structure my grandfather built in the 1950s. Solid bones, drafty windows, a stone fireplace that could heat the whole place if you fed it enough wood. Behind it, the tree line rose sharply into the foothills. In front, the meadow rolled out flat and empty all the way to the road. On clear days, you could see the next ridge over, but tonight the mountains were just dark shapes pressed against a darkening sky. I parked my truck near the porch and sat for a moment with the engine off, staring at the dark windows. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I'd just gotten bigger. Either way, the sight of it filled me with a weariness that had nothing to do with the drive. The last time I'd been here was the previous Christmas. My father had grilled steaks on the porch even though it was 30 degrees outside, because that's what he did, and we'd eaten them at the kitchen table with the radio on, barely talking, comfortable in the silence the way only people who've known each other their whole lives can be. I grabbed my duffel bag and a box of groceries, left the rest in the truck, and went inside. The air smelled like dust and old wood and something faintly sweet. Pipe tobacco, maybe, soaked into the walls over decades. My father's reading glasses were still on the kitchen counter. His boots were by the door. I set my things down and stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the silence. And that's when the grief finally punched through. It hit so hard my knees buckled. I sat down on the floor and cried for the first time since I was a boy. I pulled myself together eventually, made a sandwich, lit a fire, poured a glass of the cheap whiskey I'd brought. The house warmed up. I turned on the old radio my father kept on the mantel, found a station playing country classics, and let the music fill the emptiness. By 9 o'clock, I was feeling almost human again. That's when I heard the dog. It started as a single bark, deep, resonant, coming from somewhere behind the house near the tree line. I set down my glass and listened. Another bark, then a low, sustained growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Not a casual sound. There was weight to it, authority. I knew the sound well enough. We'd had dogs on this ranch my entire childhood, but there hadn't been a dog here in years, not since my father's old shepherd Duke had died. Duke. That was a name I hadn't said out loud in a long time. He'd been my father's shadow for 13 years. A big German shepherd with a black saddle coat and eyes the color of dark honey. 85 pounds of muscle and devotion. Loyal doesn't begin to describe what that dog was. He'd follow my father into a burning building and never hesitate. When I was young, Duke slept at the foot of my bed every night, and I'd fall asleep with my hand resting on his warm side, feeling his ribs expand and contract with each slow breath, and nothing in the world could scare me. Not the wind, not the coyotes, not the dark. Duke died when I was 17. A mountain lion had come down from the high ridges during a bad winter, desperate and starving, and Duke put himself between it and my father out by the woodshed. My father said he didn't even hesitate, just lowered his head and charged, giving my father those precious seconds to turn and run for his rifle. By the time my father got back, the cat had torn Duke open. My father shot it, but it was too late. He carried Duke back to the yard himself, all 85 pounds, and buried him under the big pine at the edge of the property, the one with the knothole that looked like an eye. I remember standing there watching my father kneel in the dirt, his hands shaking, mud on his jeans, saying nothing. He patted the mound of earth once, like he was patting Duke's side, and then stood up and walked inside. He never got another dog after that. The barking outside stopped. I went to the back window and looked out, but there was nothing. Just the dark shapes of the pines and the pale ground under the moonlight. I told myself it was probably a coyote or a neighbor's dog that had wandered up the road. I finished my whiskey and went to bed. I spent all of Saturday packing boxes. My father had accumulated decades of things: tools, books, old hunting magazines, jars of nails and screws sorted by size. In the bedroom closet, I found my mother's winter coat, still hanging where she'd left it 20-some years ago. I didn't touch it. By the time the sun started going down, I was sore, dusty, and ready for another fire and another glass of whiskey. I heated up a can of chili on the stove, ate it standing at the counter, and watched the light fade from the meadow through the kitchen window. The barking started again at dusk, closer this time. I went to the front door and opened it, stepping out onto the porch. The meadow was soaked in blue twilight, and I could see the dark wall of the forest at its edges. I couldn't see whatever was making the noise, but I could hear it. That same deep, commanding bark, circling the house from east to west. Not frantic, not aggressive, almost purposeful. Then I saw it. It was standing at the far corner of the yard, maybe 50 feet away, right where the mowed grass met the wild brush. A dog, or something shaped like one. It was large, far larger than any breed I could name, and its outline was wrong somehow, blurred, like looking at something through heat shimmer on a summer road. Its body seemed to absorb the fading light rather than reflect it, as though it were a hole cut in the world. And its eyes, two steady points of deep red, like embers breathing in the dark. I gripped the door frame. My rational mind was already assembling explanations. A stray, a trick of the light, exhaustion playing games with my perception. But something older and deeper in me, something that had grown up in these mountains and knew their rhythms, was screaming at me to get back inside. The dog, whatever it was, took a step toward me. Then another. Each movement was fluid but heavy, like something enormous trying to move gently. It stopped about 30 feet away and just stood there, watching me with those burning eyes. I stepped back inside and closed the door. I don't know how long I stood there with my back against it, breathing hard, trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen what I'd seen. Eventually, I moved to the window and looked out. The dog was still there, but it had turned away from the house. It was facing the tree line, completely still, like a sentry. While I watched, it began to pace, back and forth along the edge of the yard, always between the house and the forest, never coming closer, never leaving. It paced like that for hours. I know because I watched it, unable to sleep, unable to look away for long. Sometime around 2 a.m, it stopped. It turned its head toward the trees and let out a sound that froze the blood in my veins. Not a bark, not a howl, but something between the two, low and mournful and ancient, like a warning bell rung across a great distance. Then it resumed pacing. I must have dozed off in the armchair because I was jolted awake by knocking. 3 deliberate knocks on the front door. Not frantic, not timid, measured like someone counting the beats. I shot upright, my heart hammering. The fire had burned down to coals and the house was cold, that deep, seeping cold that gets into your bones when you're miles from another living soul. The clock on the mantel read 3:47 in the morning. I sat very still, listening. 3 more knocks, same rhythm, same force. Patient. Whatever was out there was in no hurry at all. "Hello," I called. My voice came out rougher than I intended. Nothing, just the quiet creak of the house settling. Then, very faintly, almost tenderly, "Please, I need help." It was a woman's voice, thin, tired, coming from just the other side of the door. My first instinct was to open it. Someone lost in the woods in late November could be in serious danger. Hypothermia sets in fast at this altitude, and the nearest house was miles down the road. I was halfway to the door, my hand already reaching, when I stopped. Something was wrong with the voice. Not the words. The words were normal enough. It was the delivery. There was no shivering in it, no chattering teeth, no ragged breathing, no desperation. It was flat, measured, like someone reading from a script they didn't understand, like a mouth forming sounds without a mind behind them. "Please," the voice said again, and this time I noticed something else. It came from exactly the same spot each time. No shifting of weight, no movement. As if whatever was speaking wasn't standing at the door so much as pressed against it, motionless. "It's so cold. Just open the door." I remembered my father's letter, which I hadn't read yet. I didn't know then what he'd written, but something in my gut, call it instinct, call it inheritance, told me that the thing on the other side of that door was not a woman, had never been a woman, and that if I turned that handle, I would be making the last decision of my life. I reached for the handle, and from outside came an explosion of barking, furious, unrelenting, so loud and close that the windows rattled. The shadow dog was right there on the porch, and it sounded like it was losing its mind. The barking was aimed not at the door, not at me, but outward, toward whatever was on the other side of it. Then came a sound I will never forget. A screech, high-pitched and raw, like metal scraping against stone, like something tearing a hole in the air itself. It came from right outside the door. It came from whatever had been asking me to open it. The screech was immediately followed by a cacophony of snarling, snapping jaws, and something being thrown against the side of the house hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. I backed away from the door. I grabbed the fire poker, the only thing within reach that could serve as a weapon. The sounds of a violent struggle continued outside for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then it went quiet, not gradually quiet, instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. I didn't open that door. I didn't go to the window. I sat in that armchair with the fire poker across my knees, and I did not move until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the curtains. When the sun was fully up, I finally opened the front door. The porch was a mess. Deep gouges ran along the wooden planks, some of them a quarter-inch deep, as though something with claws had been dragged across them. There were dark stains on the railing that I chose not to examine too closely. One of the porch posts had a chunk taken out of it near the base, and splinters of wood were scattered across the steps. The air smelled different, metallic, faintly organic, like turned soil after rain, but sharper. And at the edge of the yard, pressed into the soft earth, was a set of tracks. They started as footprints, narrow, elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. Human in shape, but wrong in proportion. Too long, too narrow, the stride impossibly wide. They led from the tree line to the porch in a straight, deliberate line, as if whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. And then, about 10 feet from the steps, they changed. The footprints became deeper, more erratic, gouging sideways through the mud, and beside them appeared a second set of tracks, massive paw prints, each one the size of a dinner plate, dug so deep into the ground that water had begun to pool in them. The two sets of tracks tangled together in a violent mess and then veered sharply back toward the forest, disappearing into the undergrowth. I followed them with my eyes, but not my feet. Something in my gut told me that going into those trees would be the last thing I ever did. I stood on the porch for a long time, looking at where the tracks vanished into the shadows between the pines, and I felt a gratitude so fierce it almost knocked me down. I spent the rest of that morning in a daze, packing with shaking hands, telling myself I'd leave by noon and never come back. But as I was clearing out the shelf above my father's desk, a manila envelope fell from between two books and landed at my feet. It had my name written on it in my father's cramped handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded around a photograph. The photo was old and faded. Duke as a young dog, sitting alert beside the big pine, ears up, tail straight, looking directly into the camera with those honey-colored eyes. On the back, my father had written, "Best dog I ever had. Best friend I ever had." The letter was short. My father was never a man for unnecessary words. "Son, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've come back to deal with my mess. I'm sorry for that. There are things about this land I should have told you, but I didn't know how. And maybe I was afraid you'd think your old man had lost his mind. There is something in these woods. I've known it since I was a boy. My father knew it too. It comes out when the nights get long. It has no name that I know of. It watches the house, and it waits. And if you're foolish enough to go out after dark or to open a door when it asks, you don't come back. I've found the remains. I've seen what it leaves behind. The only thing that has ever kept it at bay is Duke. I don't understand it, and I won't pretend to. But that dog has been watching over this property since the day I buried him. I've seen him at night in the yard. Always between the house and the trees. Always watching. Don't be afraid of him. He is still doing what he always did. He's protecting us. Just stay inside after dark. Don't open the door for anyone. And when you sell this place, don't feel bad about it. Some ground isn't meant to be lived on. I love you. Dad. I read the letter 3 times. Then I sat on the edge of my father's bed and held that photograph and let the tears come again. Not just for my father this time, but for a dog that had loved us so fiercely that even death couldn't make him stop. I should have left that day. Every rational part of me said to throw the boxes in the truck and go. But something held me there. Maybe it was the letter. Maybe it was the need to understand. Or maybe I just needed one more night in the place where I grew up, knowing now that I hadn't been as alone there as I'd thought. That evening, I didn't light a fire. I didn't pour a drink. I pulled a chair to the front window and sat in the dark, watching. He appeared just after the last light left the sky. Emerging from the shadows at the corner of the house, that massive, dark form, more smoke than flesh, those steady red eyes sweeping the yard. He moved to his position between the house and the trees and began his patrol. Back and forth, the guardian on his eternal watch. I put my hand against the glass. He stopped, turned his great head toward the window, looked directly at me. And for just a moment, a single flickering heartbeat, the shadows around him thinned, and I saw him. Not the monstrous shape, not the burning eyes, but him. The broad black and tan coat, the alert ears, the intelligent, gentle gaze I remembered from childhood, from all those nights when I'd fall asleep with my hand on his side. Duke. He looked at me the way he always had. Like I was the most important thing in the world. Like nothing would ever get past him to reach me. Then the shadows thickened again, and he turned back to the trees and resumed his march. I whispered something to him through the glass. I don't remember what. It didn't matter. He knew. I left at first light, the truck packed with everything I intended to keep. At the end of the driveway, I stopped and looked in the rearview mirror. The house sat quiet in the morning sun, looking exactly as it had my whole life. Small, sturdy, ordinary. The yard was empty. The trees were still. But at the base of the big pine, right where the knothole stared out like an eye, I could just make out the shape of the flat stone my father had laid over Duke's grave all those years ago. And resting on top of it, in a patch of sunlight, was a single impression in the frost, the shape of a large dog curled up as if sleeping. I sat there looking at it until a truck came up behind me on the road and I had to move. The ranch sold 6 months later. I never went back after that weekend. I never told the realtor about any of it, and I have thought about that silence more than once, wondering if it makes me a coward or simply practical. The cattle company runs livestock on the meadow now. I don't know if anyone stays there overnight. I hope they don't. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about what my father wrote. Some ground isn't meant to be lived on. I think he was right. But I also think about Duke, still out there in some form I can't explain, still walking his patrol between the house that no longer stands and the trees that still do, still watching, still protecting, not because anyone asked him to, not because he had to, but because that's what he was. Loyal past every boundary, past every limit, past death itself. I wonder sometimes if the cattle company's workers have seen him. If some ranch hand working late has glimpsed a dark shape moving through the meadow at dusk and felt, without knowing why, that he should go inside. I hope so. I hope Duke is still doing his job, even now that there's no one left to do it for. I don't pretend to understand it. I've spent hours reading about hauntings, about guardian spirits, about the old stories mountain people used to tell around fires, stories about animals that loved their owners so deeply that the love itself became a kind of anchor, holding them to the world even after the body was gone. I don't know if any of that is true. I just know that when I was in danger, when something old and hungry came knocking at my door wearing a stranger's voice, there was a dog in the yard who wouldn't let it through. And that dog had been dead for 15 years. I keep the photograph on my nightstand now. Some mornings I wake up and look at it before I look at anything else. Duke sitting by the pine tree, young and strong and alert, ready for whatever came next. And on the back, in my father's handwriting, the truest thing he ever wrote: best dog I ever had, best friend I ever had. Yeah, Dad, mine too. I need to get this out of my head. I've been carrying it for almost a year now, and every time I close my eyes at night, I see him. The man with the shovel. The one who wasn't supposed to be real. It started the summer after my first year of grad school. I was 24, running on fumes and cheap coffee, finishing a master's in environmental science at a small university in northern Connecticut. My two closest friends, Dana and Reese, had rented a house together about 40 minutes from campus, right on the edge of Millbrook, one of those towns that barely qualifies as a town. A gas station, a church, a general store, and about 600 people spread out across miles of forest. The kind of place where you could scream and no one would hear you. I didn't think about that at the time. I think about it now. Dana had invited me to stay for a long weekend. She and Reese had been together since sophomore year, and their place was this old clapboard rental tucked against the tree line. The landlord had installed trail cameras on the property after a string of break-ins in the area, but the house itself was falling apart. Warped floors, windows that didn't close all the way, a smell of mildew that never went away no matter how many candles Dana lit. But it was cheap, and it was theirs. And on Friday nights, it was the only place any of us wanted to be. That first night, the three of us were on the back porch drinking and talking about nothing important. The air had that heavy summer thickness to it. You could almost chew it. Fireflies blinked in and out of the tall grass at the edge of the yard, and beyond that, the woods were a solid black wall. I remember the smell, wet bark and pine needles, and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle from somewhere nearby. Reese had strung dollar store lights along the railing, and they gave everything this warm amber glow that made the darkness beyond the yard look even deeper. I remember feeling genuinely relaxed for the first time in months. My thesis was a mess. My advisor was impossible, and I'd just ended things with a guy who made me feel smaller every time I was around him. Being with Dana and Reese, laughing about dumb things, felt like medicine. Dana was telling a story about a student in her teaching cohort who'd brought a live frog to a presentation, and Reese kept interrupting with sound effects, and I was laughing so hard my ribs hurt. It was the kind of night where you think, okay, things are going to be fine. The kind of night that tricks you into letting your guard down. That's when Reese went quiet and grabbed Dana's arm. "Don't move," she whispered. I turned around slowly and saw it. A black bear, maybe 30 feet from the porch, standing perfectly still on all fours near the tree line. It was big, much bigger than I expected. Its fur was so dark it almost blended into the woods behind it. The only reason I could see it at all was because of the porch light reflecting off its eyes. 2 small, wet circles of light staring right at us. Dana made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a whimper. Reese was already pulling her toward the door, but I didn't move. I know that sounds stupid, and maybe it was, but I grew up in a rural part of Maine where bears wandered through backyards the way squirrels do in the suburbs. My mother used to leave apple cores on the fence posts for them. She'd grown up in Lebanon, the country, not the town in Connecticut, and she said the brown bears there were gentle, that they'd walk beside you on mountain paths like old friends. My father thought she was insane. He was probably right, but something about her fearlessness had seeped into me. "It's okay," I said. "It's just looking around. It'll leave." "Nora, get inside," Reese hissed from behind the screen door. Now, I watched the bear for another few seconds. It lowered its head, sniffed the ground, then turned and lumbered back into the darkness without a sound. The whole encounter lasted maybe a minute. Dana was shaking. Reese was furious with me. I poured myself another drink and told them about the bears in Maine, but neither of them was in the mood to hear it. We went to bed shortly after. Dana and Reese retreated to their room, and I took the guest room at the end of the hall, a narrow space with a futon that smelled like dust and a window that looked directly out onto the backyard. I lay there for a long time, listening to the house settle. Old houses never shut up. Every creak and groan felt amplified in the silence of the woods. It must have been around 3 a.m. when something woke me. Not a sound exactly, but a feeling. That specific primal awareness that you're being watched. I opened my eyes and looked at the window. There was a man standing in the backyard. He was tall, unusually tall, and motionless. He stood roughly where the bear had been, near the tree line. He had long hair, gray or white, that hung past his shoulders. He wore what looked like a heavy work jacket, dark and shapeless, and in his right hand he held something long and thin, a tool of some kind. It took me a moment to realize it was a shovel. My chest went cold. Not the poetic kind of cold you read about in books. An actual physical sensation, like someone had pressed an ice pack against my sternum. I couldn't look away from him. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, facing the house, facing my window, and I couldn't tell if he was looking at me or through me. I grabbed my phone from the floor and the screen lit up my face. When I looked back at the window, he was gone, not walking away, not fading into the trees, just gone. The yard was empty. The woods were still. I stared out that window until the sky started to lighten and the birds began their morning noise, and he didn't come back. When I told Dana and Reese at breakfast, their reactions were exactly what I expected. Concern, skepticism, and the gentle suggestion that I might have been dreaming. "You had a lot to drink, Nor," Dana said, sliding a mug of coffee across the table. "Plus, the bear thing probably freaked you out more than you think." I wasn't dreaming. I sat up. I grabbed my phone. I was awake. Reese was already on the laptop, pulling up the trail camera feed. She scrubbed through the footage from overnight. There was the bear at 9:47, the same one we'd seen, standing in the yard, sniffing the air, leaving. Then hours of nothing. At 3:11, the camera caught movement. I leaned forward, my heart beating fast. But on the screen, it was the bear again. Same bear, same spot, standing on its hind legs this time, its snout raised toward the roof. It stood there for almost 2 minutes, eerily still, then dropped to all fours and disappeared into the trees. "That's what you saw," Reese said, not unkindly. "The bear came back and you were half asleep. Your brain filled in the rest." I wanted to argue, but the footage was right there. A bear, not a man. The camera didn't lie, and I had no evidence that my eyes were more reliable than a motion-activated lens in the dark. I let it go, or I tried to. The next morning, I went for a walk. I told Dana and Reese I needed air, which was true, but what I really needed was to stop thinking about the man with the shovel. Millbrook was the kind of town where a walk could take you nowhere for miles. I followed the main road past the church, past the general store with its faded American flag, past a row of houses that all looked like they were built in the same decade and hadn't been touched since. The town sat in a shallow valley surrounded by hills thick with pine and oak, and on a clear morning you could see for miles in every direction. It was beautiful in a lonely way. I walked longer than I meant to. I was lost in my own head, replaying the image of the man over and over, turning it like a stone in my pocket. The road led me past a cemetery with tilted headstones and a rusted iron gate, past a pond that was perfectly still and reflected the sky like a dropped mirror. At some point, I stopped checking street signs. My feet just kept moving, as if they knew where they were going, even though I didn't. When I finally looked up, I realized I'd wandered into a part of town I hadn't been to before. The road narrowed and the houses thinned out until there were none at all. Just a stretch of cracked asphalt with weeds pushing through, and, on one side, a row of old brick buildings set back from the road. They were industrial looking, maybe old mills or factories. But one of them was different. It was larger than the others, with tall, arched windows that were mostly boarded up and a front entrance framed by stone columns. It looked institutional, like a school or a hospital. Something about its proportions felt wrong, like it was too big for a town this small, too deliberate for a place this forgotten. I stopped walking. The air had changed. I don't know how to describe it other than to say that everything got quiet. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The kind of silence that feels like pressure against your eardrums. No birds, no wind, no cars in the distance, just nothing. And then I heard it. A rhythmic, scraping sound, metal against earth. I turned toward the building and saw him. The same man. The same long gray hair. The same dark jacket. The same shovel. He was around the side of the building, digging into the ground with a kind of desperate intensity that made my stomach clench. He wasn't just digging a hole. He was tearing at the earth, throwing dirt in wide arcs, his shoulders heaving with the effort. I should have run. Every rational part of my brain was telling me to turn around and walk fast in the other direction. But my feet carried me closer, as if the silence itself was pulling me toward him. When I was maybe 20 feet away, I heard my own voice, small, almost childlike, say, "Who are you?" He stopped digging. He didn't turn around right away. He just stood there, breathing hard, the shovel planted in the loose soil. When he finally turned, I saw his face clearly for the first time. He was old, much older than I'd guessed from the window. His skin was deeply lined and weathered to the color of dark copper. His eyes were pale gray, almost silver, and they looked through me the same way they had from the yard. There was no surprise in his expression, no alarm, just exhaustion. An exhaustion so deep it seemed to go beyond the physical. "I'm looking for them," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel being dragged across wood. "I've been looking for so long." "Looking for who?" "My friends." He turned back to the hole. It was deep, deep enough that he was standing in it up to his shins. "They put them somewhere here. I know they did. I can feel them under the ground." The words hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. There was no menace in them. No madness, even. Just grief. Pure, distilled, ancient grief. I felt my eyes sting, and I didn't understand why. "What is this place?" I asked. He looked up at the building. In the silence, I could hear the faintest creak from somewhere inside, as if the structure itself was breathing. "This is where they sent us," he said. "Harmon House. They brought us here when we were small. They cut our hair. They beat the language out of us. Some of us didn't leave. Some of us went into the ground." The moment he said those words, something happened that I still cannot fully explain. The air around me thickened, like walking into a room where the humidity is unbearable, and my vision blurred at the edges. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, sharp and sudden, as if someone had pressed their thumbs against my temples. And then I saw things, or felt them, or remembered them. I genuinely don't know which word is right, and I've spent months trying to decide. Children in gray uniforms walking single file down a dim hallway. Their feet were bare against stone floors, and their heads were freshly shaved, nicked and scabbed in places. A woman in black robes standing at the end of the hall holding a long switch. The sound of a door slamming, reverberating through walls that were too thick. Small hands gripping the edge of a metal bed frame in a room with no windows. The smell of lye and something underneath it. Something organic and wrong. And beneath all of it, the sound of muffled crying that seemed to come not from any one direction, but from below. From under the floorboards. From the ground itself. Then it was gone. All of it. The images, the thickness in the air, the silence. Sound rushed back in like a wave. Birds, a distant engine, the rustle of wind in the trees. I was standing on the side of the road, alone. The man was gone. The hole he'd been digging was gone. The building was still there, but now it looked different somehow, smaller. More ordinary. Just an old brick structure with weeds growing up its walls and a sparrow perched on the windowsill, watching me with its head cocked. I sat down on the curb and stayed there for a long time. My hands were shaking. There was a metallic taste in my mouth, like I'd bitten my tongue. I kept looking at the spot where the hole should have been. But the ground was flat and undisturbed, covered in a carpet of dead leaves and pine needles. No fresh dirt, no shovel marks, nothing. I walked back to the house in a kind of trance. When I got there, Dana was on the porch looking concerned. She said they'd tried calling me, but my phone had been dead. I looked at the screen. Full battery. No missed calls, but the time showed I'd been gone for over 4 hours. It had felt like 40 minutes at most. "You look awful, Noor," Dana said. "What happened?" I almost told her. The words were right there, pressing against the back of my teeth. But something stopped me. Not fear of being disbelieved. I was already used to that. It was more like the feeling that what the man had told me wasn't mine to share casually. That his grief deserved more than a retelling over coffee. "Just walked too far," I said. "Got a little dehydrated." That afternoon, Reese showed me something on her phone. A silver alert had gone out the day before for a man named Thomas Blackwood, 78 years old, who had walked away from a care facility about 15 miles from Millbrook. The description said he was 6'4" with long gray hair, last seen wearing a dark coat. Reese looked at me with raised eyebrows. "That's your guy, Noor. The one you saw from the window. He's probably been wandering around the area, and the bear on camera was just a coincidence." I nodded. I told her she was probably right. A confused old man from a care home. A bear that happened to be in the same spot. A sleep-deprived grad student whose brain connected dots that weren't there. That explanation was clean and logical, and it should have been enough. But it wasn't. Because when I got home that Sunday night, I searched for Harmon House. I tried every combination I could think of. Harmon House, Millbrook. Harmon House, Connecticut. Harmon House Indian School. Harmon House Reform School. Nothing. Not a single result. I searched for Native American boarding schools in Connecticut and found a few historical references. Real places with real names and real documented horrors. But nothing called Harmon House. I searched the address of the brick building based on my best recollection, and found records of an old textile mill that had been abandoned since the 1960s. No school, no institution, no record of children. I searched for Thomas Blackwood. The silver alert had been updated. He'd been found later that same day, disoriented but unharmed, near a gas station about 10 miles from the care facility. He was safely returned. The alert was closed. That should have been the end of it. I went back to Millbrook 3 more times over the next 2 months. Each time, I told Dana and Reese I just wanted to hang out, which was partly true. But every visit, I'd take a walk and find my way back to that stretch of road with the brick buildings. The large one was always there. I wasn't imagining the building itself, but it was always just a building. Quiet, abandoned, unremarkable. No silence. No pressure in the air. No scraping of metal against earth. Just weeds and crumbling mortar and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the undergrowth. I never saw the man again. I never felt that terrible silence again. Once, I pressed my hand flat against the brick wall and held it there, as if the building might speak to me through my palm. I felt nothing but cold stone. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. I even made an appointment with a therapist, though I canceled it twice before finally going. "It sounds like you had a very intense experience," she said after I'd told her a carefully edited version. "Stress, sleep deprivation, and alcohol can absolutely create vivid episodes that feel completely real." I agreed with her because agreeing was easier than explaining that I'd been stone cold sober during the second encounter, that I hadn't slept badly the night before, that the images I saw weren't dreamlike or fuzzy. They were sharp, detailed, and carried a weight of emotion that didn't feel like mine. I let months pass. Fall came, and the leaves turned and the air got sharp. I buried myself in my thesis and tried not to think about Millbrook. It mostly worked, the way avoidance mostly works. You function fine during the day, and then at 3 a.m. you lie awake staring at the ceiling, hearing a voice say, "I've been looking for so long," in a tone that makes your chest ache. In late October, Dana invited me back for a weekend. The foliage was at its peak and she wanted to take photos. I said yes because I missed them, and because a small, stubborn part of me wanted to go back to that road one more time. Just to confirm that there was nothing there, just to close the loop. We spent Saturday hiking and taking pictures and eating too much of Reese's chili. It was a good day, the kind of day that makes you forget everything else. That night, we sat on the back porch again, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot cider and watching the stars through the bare branches overhead. It was cold enough that our breath made little clouds in the porch light. The yard was a carpet of fallen leaves, orange and red, leading to the dark edge of the forest. We'd been out there maybe an hour when Dana suddenly grabbed my hand. "Oh my God," she breathed. "It's back." The bear. It emerged from the tree line slowly, almost carefully, and walked to the center of the yard. It was the same one. I was sure of it, though I couldn't have told you how I knew. Same size, same impossibly dark fur. But this time, instead of standing and sniffing the air, it just stopped and stood on all fours, its head low. It was carrying something in its mouth. I stood up. Reese reached for my arm, but I stepped forward, off the porch, onto the cold grass. I wasn't afraid. I should have been. Later, I would ask myself why I wasn't, and I would never come up with a satisfactory answer. The bear looked at me, not a glance, a look, long and steady and deliberate. Its eyes caught the porch light, and they were pale, almost gray. And in that moment, I felt the same weight I'd felt on that silent street, the same thickness in the air, the same ache in my chest that didn't belong to me. Then the bear gently set down what it was carrying, a bone, pale and smooth, unmistakably a bone, though I couldn't tell you from what. It placed it on the leaves with something that I swear looked like tenderness. Then it turned, and without hurrying, walked back to the tree line and disappeared. None of us moved for a long time. Dana was crying. Reese had her hand over her mouth. I stood barefoot in the cold grass, looking at the white shape on the ground, and I understood. I didn't have proof. I didn't have logic. I just understood. He found them. I don't know who Thomas Blackwood was or wasn't. I don't know if what I saw on that street was real, or a hallucination, or something in between that our language doesn't have a word for. I never found Harmon House in any record, and I've looked. Believe me, I've looked. I've spent hours in library archives and on genealogy websites and in the comments sections of obscure historical forums. Nothing. It's as if the place existed only for me, only in that moment, and then folded itself back into whatever silence it came from. What I do know is that across this country, there are places where children were taken and never returned, and some of those places have been found and some haven't. Some of them have been paved over, built on top of, turned into parking lots and strip malls and quiet stretches of road where nobody stops. The ground remembers what we don't. I believe that now in a way I never believed anything before. I went back to the yard the next morning. The bone was gone. No trace of it in the leaves. Dana said maybe an animal took it. Reese said maybe we imagined it in the dark. Maybe they're right. But some nights when the house is quiet and I'm lying in bed waiting for sleep, I hear the scraping of a shovel against earth. Distant, rhythmic, patient. And instead of fear, I feel something closer to hope. Like somewhere, in some place I can't see or reach or prove exists. Someone is still digging, still searching, still refusing to let the lost stay lost. I just hope he finds them all. I still check the tree line. Every night, no matter where I am, no matter how many years pass, I find myself turning toward the nearest window just before I shut off the lights. I scan the dark edge of whatever woods or fence or parking lot sits outside, and I hold my breath until my chest burns. Most nights, there's nothing there. But most nights isn't every night, and that difference is what keeps me awake. I need to tell someone about this. I've carried it for almost 9 years now, and the weight hasn't gotten lighter. If anything, it's settled deeper into me, fused with the bone. So here it is, the thing I saw, the thing I should have told her, and the silence that cost me everything. I grew up in the southern Appalachian foothills, where the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute drive, and the nearest neighbor was close enough to wave at, but far enough that you'd need to shout. Our house sat on a few acres of cleared land backed up against a dense wall of hardwoods, oak, hickory, poplar, that climbed the ridge and disappeared into what felt like forever. As a kid, that forest was my entire universe. I spent every spare hour out there, building lean-tos from fallen branches, flipping rocks in the creek for salamanders, stealing bags of animal feed from my dad's hunting gear and spreading it across clearings so I could sit motionless behind fallen logs and watch white-tailed does graze in the early evening light, their ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. My mother used to say I was half feral, and she wasn't entirely wrong. I knew the rhythms of those woods the way other kids knew the layout of a video game. Coyotes sang around 11 and went quiet by 3. Black bears came through in late summer to strip the wild blackberry bushes along the South Ridge. I knew every deer trail, every game path, every hollow where the fog pooled on cold mornings. That knowledge made me feel safe. It made me feel like the woods belonged to me, or that I belonged to them, which is almost the same thing. What I didn't know was that something else had learned those rhythms too. Her name was Ellie. She transferred to our high school junior year, which in a town that small was roughly equivalent to a comet impact. New people didn't arrive. They left. Ellie was from Charlotte, which to us might as well have been Paris. She dressed differently, talked about things we'd never heard of, and had this way of looking at you when you spoke that made you feel like every word actually mattered. She had dark eyes that always seemed to be processing something 3 steps ahead of whatever was happening, and a laugh that came out sudden and loud and completely without self-consciousness. I was 17, all elbows and bravado, and I was absolutely terrified of her. It took me 2 weeks to say anything beyond "hey" in the hallway, and when I finally asked if she wanted to grab food after school, I delivered the line with the smooth confidence of someone defusing a bomb for the first time. She said yes anyway. She told me once it was because I looked like I might actually pass out if she said no, and she didn't want that on her conscience. We fell into each other the way teenagers do, fast and completely, and with the unshakable certainty that nothing this good could ever end. Within 2 months, she'd met my parents, and I'd survived a painfully awkward dinner with hers. Within 3, I'd shown her the woods behind my house. The forest was the most honest thing I had to offer. No pretense, no performance. Just the smell of wet leaves and the way the late afternoon light broke through the canopy. Ellie wasn't an outdoors person, but she appreciated it the way she appreciated everything, with genuine, quiet attention. We developed a routine. Most evenings, she'd come over after school. Homework at the kitchen table, dinner with my parents, then the couch in the living room for bad TV until curfew at 9:30. Every night ended the same way. Down the back porch steps, across the gravel to the carport, into my dad's truck, and the 10-minute drive to her house. It was during those walks to the carport that it started. I don't know exactly when. These things don't arrive with announcements. But at some point, maybe a month in, maybe 6 weeks, I started to feel watched. Not the vague, paranoid tingle you get walking through a dark parking garage. This was specific, directional. Like someone had drawn a line from somewhere behind me straight through my skull, and I could feel the weight of it resting on the back of my neck. It always came from the tree line. I'd turn and look every time, and every time I'd see nothing but the dark mass of the forest, the trees blending into one solid wall. The motion sensor light above the carport threw a weak yellow cone that reached maybe 15 feet into the yard. Beyond that, just blackness and the occasional glint of starlight on leaves. I didn't tell Ellie. What would I say? The woods feel weird? I'm scared of the dark now. Instead, I started closing the living room blinds earlier in the evening. When Ellie asked why, I'd mumble something about the glare on the TV screen and change the subject. She accepted this because she had no reason not to. She didn't know that every time we sat on that couch, I could feel something standing out there in the dark, patient as stone, watching us through the glass. The first time I actually saw it was mid-October. The leaves had turned but hadn't dropped yet, so the tree line was a wall of orange and rust that looked beautiful in daylight and eerie as hell after dark. There was a solid moon that night, not quite full, but bright enough to wash everything in that pale blue-gray light that makes the familiar look alien. We were on the back porch steps, and the feeling hit me so hard I actually stopped walking. Ellie bumped into my back and laughed, asked me what was wrong. I didn't answer. I was staring at the tree line, and this time, something was staring back. At the edge of the woods, maybe 200 feet out, stood a shape. Tall, four-legged, motionless. I squinted and felt the tension in my chest release. A deer, just a buck, standing alone at the forest's edge. Big rack of antlers silhouetted against the dark trees behind him. Ellie followed my gaze and let out a soft gasp of delight. She'd never seen a deer this close, or what passed for close at that distance. We watched it for a minute, and then I put in the code for the carport light and got us into the truck. As we pulled out, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The deer hadn't moved. Not a twitch, not a shift. That should have been my first clue. We saw it again the next night. Same spot, same posture, same absolute stillness. And the night after that. Ellie started calling him Atlas because of the massive antlers that looked like they were holding up the sky. The name stuck. At first, I told myself it was normal. Deer are habitual creatures. They follow the same paths, graze the same clearings. A buck staking out territory at the edge of a field wasn't unusual. But things about Atlas were wrong. Small things, the kind you feel before you consciously register them. He never flicked his ears the way deer do, that constant restless rotation scanning for sound. His tail never twitched. When the other deer nearby startled at a sudden noise, a car door, the metallic clang of the carport light clicking on, Atlas never flinched. His proportions were subtly off too. His legs were thicker than they should have been, the joints less defined. His midsection sagged in a way that didn't look like fat or muscle, but like something hanging loose, and his head moved wrong. When he lowered it to graze, it didn't dip with the smooth, natural motion of a feeding deer. It dropped, quick and mechanical, like the head of a bobbing toy. There was a distinct bounce when it settled, the same unnatural motion when it rose back up. Ellie thought he'd been hit by a car. I agreed, because the alternative was something I couldn't put into words, just a hot knot of wrongness sitting in the pit of my stomach. Every night, Atlas was a little closer, not by much. 5 feet, maybe 10. The kind of distance you wouldn't notice unless you were paying attention. I was paying attention. I'd started using the fence posts along the property line as reference points. Night after night, the number shrank. The feeling of being watched grew proportionally. It wasn't just during our walks to the carport anymore. It followed me inside. I'd feel it on the couch with Ellie's head on my shoulder, her warmth pressing against me while something cold pressed against the window. I'd feel it when I went to the kitchen for water at midnight. I'd feel it in my bed, in the dark, in the space between closing my eyes and falling asleep. I started spending more time at Ellie's house. Her place was in a development closer to town, with streetlights and no tree line crouching at the edge of the yard. Being there should have helped, but the feeling had learned my address. It showed up everywhere, a background hum I couldn't turn off. November came. The trees went bare, and without the leaves, the forest opened up. I could see deeper into the woods than before, and what I saw was nothing, which somehow made it worse. Atlas kept his vigil. Some nights he had company, other deer browsing around him like he was just another member of the herd. Most nights he was alone. I noticed new things each time. The way his hide seemed to ripple in the wind differently from the real deer. Heavier, slower, like wet canvas. The way his neck had a thick ridge at the base that could have been a mane, or could have been where two separate pieces of material joined together. And he still had his antlers. By that point in the season, most bucks had shed theirs. I'd been finding dropped antlers since I was 8. It was one of the reliable rhythms of the natural world. But Atlas's rack stayed firmly in place, tall and proud and wrong. The last night happened in December, the week before Christmas break. Ellie and I had plans, a ski trip, her first. We'd spent the evening packing gear and arguing about whether she needed her own goggles, and at some point we'd collapsed on the couch and fallen asleep. I woke up at 12:45. Ellie was curled against my side, breathing slow and even. I gently shook her awake. She murmured something about a wonderful dream, and I told her she could tell me about it in the truck. We pulled on our coats and stepped out onto the back porch. The cold hit first, the kind that has weight to it, that presses against your skin like a hand. A light snow had fallen while we slept, coating everything in a thin, clean white. The moon was nearly full, and the snow amplified its light, turning the yard bright as dusk. I could see the tree line clearly, every trunk, every bare branch. And the field was full of deer. I stopped on the second step. Ellie, half a step behind me, made a small sound. Not a word, just a breath. Below us, spread across the yard between the house and the woods, were more deer than I'd ever seen gathered in one place. 30, maybe 40, maybe more. Does yearlings, a few young bucks. Heads down, eating something off the churned snow. steam rising from their bodies, ears swiveling, tails flicking. Normal deer behavior. Completely, reassuringly normal, except for Atlas. He was at the far edge of the group, near the tree line, perfectly still. Even among all those animals, he was immediately identifiable. The massive silhouette, the towering antlers, the slightly wrong proportions. While every other deer moved and breathed and lived, Atlas stood like a photograph of himself. Ellie tugged my sleeve. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Can I get a closer picture of Atlas?" My stomach dropped. I looked at her face, bright with wonder, and I looked at Atlas, dark with something I couldn't name. "Stay here," I said. "I'll go. I don't want to spook him." What I meant was, I don't want you near that thing. She handed me her phone. I stepped off the porch and into the snow. The crunch of my boots sent a ripple through the herd. The nearest deer lifted their heads, assessed me, and trotted away. As I walked, the herd parted in a slow, organic wave. Some bolted toward the neighbor's property. Others drifted back toward the woods. A few circled behind me, back toward the house. Atlas didn't move. The herd thinned. The last of the nearby deer slipped away, and then it was just open snow, trampled hoofprints, and Atlas standing 40 feet ahead. With every step, the knot in my stomach pulled tighter. Details were resolving that distance had previously hidden. 30 feet. His fur was wrong, not the smooth coat of a whitetail in winter. It had a matte quality, almost textured, and it folded on itself in places, puckering around the midsection where a real animal's hide would stretch taut over muscle. His belly hung lower than any deer I'd ever seen, the underside drooping like fabric weighed down by gravity. 20 feet. The antlers were enormous, far larger than any whitetail should carry. They curved and branched in a pattern I recognized not from the woods, but from the wall above my uncle's fireplace. Elk antlers, mounted elk antlers, and at their base, where they met the skull, I could see the edge of something flat and circular. Wood, a mounting plaque, 15 feet. My legs kept moving despite every nerve ending screaming at me to stop. The head wasn't a deer's head at all. It was a taxidermy elk head, the kind you'd find in a hunting lodge. One glass eye was normal, dark and round and reflective. The other was grotesquely oversized, bulging from the socket, black and glossy. It wasn't a glass eye. It was a lens, 10 feet. The body was fabric, cheap, synthetic, painted with white dots in a crude approximation of a fawn's spots. The tail was a bundle of frayed brown material, like a mop head stapled to the hindquarters. Snow had piled on the back, and the fabric sagged inward under its weight, revealing the hollow space beneath where a living body should have been. The legs were too thick, wrapped in layered material that ended in shapeless masses roughly the width of a human foot in a heavy boot. And around this thing, the snow was pristine. No hoofprints, no tracks, just smooth, unbroken white. I was close enough to hear it. No breath came from the taxidermied mouth, no fog from the nostrils. The chest didn't rise or fall, but from behind that oversized lens, that wrong eye, a thin curl of white vapor drifted upward into the frozen air. Warm breath escaping from behind glass. Something was in there. Something alive, crouched inside that hollow frame, peering out at me through a camera lens where an eye should be. My body moved before my mind did. One step back, then another. My heel caught something buried in the snow, and I went down hard, arms flailing. Face inches from the ground, I saw what I'd tripped over. A yellow bag of animal feed, half buried, surrounded by empty chip wrappers, hand warmer packets, and a crushed energy drink can. Whoever was inside that costume had been coming here, night after night, for months, setting out feed to draw the real deer in, building a crowd to hide among, inching closer to my house, closer to us, watching. I ran. I don't remember deciding to. It just happened, like a hand pulling back from a hot stove. I tripped again almost immediately, face first into the snow, and the cold against my skin cracked something open inside me. By the time I was back on my feet, I was crying, the ugly kind from a place deeper than sadness, where your body stores the fear it can't process in the moment. Ellie saw me coming. I could see her face change even through the blur of tears, excitement collapsing into confusion, then fear. She started running toward me with open arms, but I was moving too fast. I crashed into her, and we both went down on the frozen gravel. She was asking me questions. Words weren't landing. I was already on my feet, punching the code into the keypad, pulling her toward the truck. She was fighting me, not to stay, but because she was terrified and confused, and I was scaring her almost as much as what was standing 200 feet behind us in a dead animal's skin. Get in the car. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was flat, stripped of everything. Cole, what happened? What's wrong? Talk to me. Get in the car, Ellie. Now. She got in. We both did. I fumbled the key into the ignition, threw it into reverse, and pulled out too fast. The tires slipped and caught and slipped again, and by some miracle, we didn't end up in a ditch. I drove to her house in a silence broken only by both of us trying to breathe normally and failing. When I pulled into her driveway, she turned to me. Eyes red, cheeks wet, voice shaking but controlled, which somehow made it worse. What happened out there, Cole? I stared at the steering wheel. Please, whatever it is, just tell me. I'll understand. That was the thing. She would understand. Ellie was the smartest person I'd ever met, and she'd understand exactly what I'd seen. Then she'd have to carry it too. She'd know something had been watching us for months, that it had stood outside our window while we watched TV, that it had been 10 feet from her while she slept on my chest, that it had a lens for an eye, recording, collecting, cataloging. I told myself I was protecting her. I told myself some knowledge is a wound that doesn't heal, and I loved her too much to inflict it. My 17-year-old brain wrapped cowardice in the language of sacrifice and called it noble. I just got spooked, I said. I'm sorry. It was nothing. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her face. Fear shifting into a specific kind of hurt that comes when someone you trust chooses to shut you out. She asked again, softer, and I said nothing. She asked a third time, and her voice broke, and I sat there and let it break. She got out of the truck without saying goodnight. The porch light clicked off behind her. I drove to the far end of town and parked behind the hardware store and sat there until the sun came up, watching every shadow, checking every mirror, listening for footsteps that never came. My father was standing in the carport when I pulled in, vibrating with fury. I barely heard him. I was looking at the field. In daylight, the evidence was everywhere. Hundreds of tracks in the churned snow, and at the far edge, a patch of ground littered with trash, chip bags, hand warmer wrappers, empty cans, a flattened cardboard box, and a yellow bag of feed, the same brand my dad kept in the shed for bow season, the same brand I used to steal as a kid to lure deer close enough to watch. Someone had been using it for the same purpose, except they weren't watching the deer. I walked out there while my dad shouted at my back. I stood in the spot where Atlas had stood and looked back at the house. From that angle, you could see the living room window clearly, the back porch, the carport. You could see the couch where Ellie and I fell asleep together, night after night, framed perfectly in the warm glow of the lamp we always left on. Everything. Whoever had stood in this spot had watched all of it. I sat down in the cold snow and felt nothing. Not fear, not relief, not the cold. Just a vast, ringing emptiness, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left the shell sitting upright in a field. The sheriff came out that afternoon, took photos, said they'd look into it. Probably just kids, he said. Likely a prank. Words designed to make a terrified teenager feel like he was overreacting. The investigation went nowhere. No suspects, no leads, no explanation. Ellie didn't pick up when I called. When she finally called back that evening, the conversation lasted 4 minutes. She wasn't angry, she said. She was hurt. She needed space, maybe a break. I said okay, because I couldn't tell her the truth without giving her nightmares, and I couldn't explain my behavior without the truth. I'd built a trap out of silence, and the door had shut. The ski trip didn't happen. The break became a breakup, which became distance, which became that specific silence between two people who used to be everything and are now nothing. She transferred schools at the end of the year. Her family moved back to Charlotte. I heard through friends she was doing well, that she'd gotten into a good college, that she was happy. I chose to believe that. That was 9 years ago. I've replayed it thousands of times. Every time I change the ending, I tell her the truth in the truck. I let her in instead of shutting her out, and we face it together, and the weight is halved because it's shared. But I didn't do any of that. I made a decision in the cab of a pickup truck on a frozen December night, and I've lived inside that decision ever since. Here's what haunts me most: not the costume, not the lens, not the months of patient stalking, or the trash that proved someone had camped in my backyard night after night, watching us live like we were a show put on for their benefit. What haunts me is the thing I never got to ask Ellie. That night, when I shook her awake on the couch, she said she'd been having a wonderful dream. She was going to tell me about it in the truck. She never did, because by the time we got to the truck, everything had fallen apart. I think about that dream constantly. What was so wonderful that it made her smile in her sleep? Was it about us? About the ski trip? About some bright future she could see and I couldn't? I'll never know. That dream is locked inside a moment I destroyed, a door I closed and can never reopen. Sometimes, late at night, when the feeling comes and I turn toward the window and scan the dark for shapes that shouldn't be there, I wonder if whoever was inside that costume is still out there somewhere, still watching, still patient, still wearing a dead thing's face and standing just close enough to be mistaken for something natural. And I wonder, if I'd told her the truth, would she have been safer? Would she have been more careful, more watchful? Or was my silence the only shield I had to offer, thin and brittle as it was? I don't know. I'll never know. That's the worst kind of horror, not the kind that chases you through the woods, but the kind that sits quietly in the space between what you did and what you should have done, growing heavier with every year that passes. I still check the tree line. I always will. I used to think the worst part of my job was the smell. 7 years photographing crime scenes, and I thought I had it figured out. You learn to breathe through your mouth. You learn to focus on the viewfinder and treat everything like composition. Light, angle, distance. You learn to see a body not as a person, but as evidence, a shape, a problem to be documented. But the Whitfield apartment taught me something I wasn't prepared for. Some scenes don't stay inside the frame. Some of them follow you home. It was a Wednesday in October when Detective Rains called me out to the Linden Grove complex on the east side of town. One of those mid-range apartment buildings, 3 stories, tan brick, the kind of place where young families settle before they can afford a house. I remember the trees outside had just started turning, and there was that crisp bite in the air that makes you want to zip your jacket up to the chin. 2 patrol cars were already parked out front, lights off. A small cluster of residents hovered near the entrance, arms folded, trading quiet speculation. I grabbed my gear bag from the trunk and headed up to the 2nd floor. The door to apartment 214 was propped open with a rubber wedge. A uniformed officer I didn't recognize waved me through with a look that said good luck. The first thing that hit me was the copper. Not just the smell, the taste of it, thick and metallic, coating the back of my throat before I'd even crossed the threshold. I pulled my mask up and tried to settle into my usual routine. Viewfinder, composition, evidence. But this scene didn't want to be composed. The living room looked like it had been through a blender. Furniture overturned. A bookshelf face down on the carpet. Its contents fanned out in a soggy arc of ruined paperbacks. The television lay screen down, cracked. Every surface carried a wash of dark red that had already begun to brown at the edges. And scattered among the chaos were coins, dozens of them, as if someone had smashed open a jar of loose change and let it rain. I photographed the room in wide shots first, then worked inward. That's when I found the first victim. A man in his 50s, seated upright in a dining chair as if he'd been placed there on purpose, though the chair was in the middle of the living room, far from any table. His face was a ruin. I won't describe it further than that, because even now my mind shies away from the specifics. The The camera captured what I couldn't hold in my head. Click. The second victim was in the hallway. A woman, mid-40s perhaps, lying face down. Whatever had been done to her had been thorough and savage. I documented her in 4 shots and moved on, my hand steady even as something behind my ribs had begun to tremble. Near the large windows at the front of the apartment, I found the third victim. A teenage boy, maybe 15 or 16. He'd been trying to get out. You could tell by his position, slumped against the window frame, one hand still tangled in the remnants of a torn curtain, as though he'd been clawing for the glass when it happened. I took the photo and looked away. That was 3 out of 4. The Whitfield family. Father, mother, son. And then there was the cat. It lay in the far corner of the room, almost tucked behind an overturned end table. An orange tabby, mouth stretched impossibly wide, with something dark and viscous, not red like the rest of the blood in the apartment, but black, almost tar-like, pooled beneath its jaw. No visible wounds on its body. It looked like it had simply opened its mouth as wide as it could and let something awful pour out of it. I crouched down to frame the shot. Through the viewfinder, I could see its eyes, glassy, fixed, the pupils drawn to thin vertical slits. I pressed the shutter, and right as the flash fired, I could have sworn those pupils moved, contracted, adjusted. I pulled back from the camera and stared at the cat for a long 5 seconds. It didn't move again. Of course it didn't. It was dead. Things happen to eyes after death. Muscle contractions, fluid shifts. I knew that. I still backed away from it faster than I needed to. Out on the balcony, I pulled my mask down and let the October air scrub my lungs clean. 2 officers were leaning against the railing, sharing a conversation that drifted toward me whether I wanted it or not. "She won't stop saying it," one of them muttered. "Just keeps repeating the same thing. Over and over. The cat thing? Yeah, the cat did it. The cat did it. Like a broken record." They found her standing in the middle of all that with a cleaver hanging from one hand, covered head to toe, and she just keeps saying the damn cat killed her family. The other officer let out a short, humorless laugh. Sure, the cat picked up a cleaver and went to work, then handed it to her and crawled off to die. Public defender's gonna have a fun time with this one. I didn't laugh. I went back inside to finish the job. In the bedroom at the back of the apartment, I found something that didn't make it into any logical category. A trail of paw prints, small, bloody, unmistakably feline, ran along the wall. Not the floor. The wall. Starting about 4 feet up, they continued in a straight line all the way to the ceiling, then across the ceiling itself, as if the animal had simply decided that gravity was a suggestion. I stared at those prints for a long time. Cats can climb, sure. They can scale some impressive surfaces. But drywall? A painted, flat, vertical wall? And then onto a ceiling? Upside down? I photographed them from 3 angles and told myself there had to be an explanation. There always is. I finished the job around 6 in the evening, downloaded the images to the department server, and drove home with the radio turned up loud enough to rattle the speakers. I didn't want to sit in silence. Silence felt dangerous for reasons I couldn't articulate. I lived with two guys back then, Derek and Paul. We shared a 3-bedroom apartment a few miles from the precinct. Derek was a nurse who worked night shifts more often than not. Paul was between careers, spending most of his time on the couch with his laptop and a rotating cast of animals he'd foster through a local shelter. There was always something in the apartment. A dog, a rabbit, once a bearded dragon named Captain. It was Paul's thing. The rest of us tolerated it. When I got home, Derek was already gone for his shift. Paul was in the living room with his headphones on, editing something on his laptop. A large gray dog lay at his feet, tail thumping lazily when I walked in. "Rough day?" Paul asked without looking up. "Yeah." Want to talk about it?" "No." He nodded. That was the kind of roommate Paul was. No pressure, no probing. I appreciated it more than usual that night. I heated up leftover pasta and tried to watch something on my phone, some comedy special I'd been meaning to get to. But every time the comedian paused for a beat, my brain filled the silence with that apartment. The coins on the carpet, the boy tangled in the curtain, the cat's mouth stretched open like a scream frozen in time, and those paw prints on the ceiling. I kept coming back to the girl, the Whitfield daughter, 19 years old, studying nursing at the community college. No prior history of violence, no history of mental illness, nothing. And she was standing in the middle of that carnage, holding a cleaver, telling anyone who would listen that the family cat had done it all. The cops had already made up their minds. The evidence was, on paper, straightforward. But I'd been in this job long enough to know that the tidiest explanations sometimes papered over the strangest truths. At some point, the exhaustion won. I fell asleep with the phone on my chest, the comedian's voice fading into a distant murmur. I snapped awake to the sound of a cat. Not a normal meow, not the kind you hear outside at night, the territorial yowling of strays in an alley. This was a single, sustained note. High-pitched, thin, almost like a whistle wrapped in something organic. It drilled into my ears with a precision that felt intentional, as if the sound knew exactly which frequency would pull me from sleep. I lay there for a moment, disoriented. My room was completely dark. I remembered leaving the bedside lamp on, but the bulb was dead. I reached for my phone. 2:17 in the morning, battery at 9%. The mewing continued, distant but insistent, threading through the walls like a needle through cloth. I noticed then that the apartment was unnaturally still. No hum from the refrigerator. No low drone from the router in the hallway. The power was out. I confirmed it when I saw that the little green light on the smoke detector above the bathroom door, the one that always glowed like a tiny sentinel, had gone dark. The only light in the world was the pale rectangle of my phone screen. Paul, I thought. He must have taken in a cat and forgotten to mention it. It wouldn't be the first time. I swung my legs off the bed and opened my door. The hallway was pitch black. The power was out, I realized, because the little green light on the smoke detector that always glowed above the bathroom door was gone. I held my phone up, its feeble light pushing back maybe 5 feet of darkness. The mewing was coming from the direction of the living room. I made my way down the hall, stepping carefully, and the sound grew with each step, louder, more layered somehow, as though multiple voices were converging on the same note. By the time I reached the living room doorway, it was loud enough to make my jaw clench. And then, the moment I stepped through the doorway, it stopped. Just gone. Like someone had pressed mute on the world. The silence that replaced it was worse. It had a weight to it, a density that pressed against my eardrums. I swept my phone's light across the room. Paul was asleep on the couch. He often crashed there when he was fostering animals, to be near them if they got anxious at night. The gray dog was gone, probably put in the crate in Paul's room. No sign of any cat. I checked behind the furniture, under the coffee table, in the kitchen. Nothing. No cat, no source for the sound. I stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, listening, and heard only the refrigerator ticking in the absence of power. I told myself, neighborhood stray. Sound carries strangely at night. Old building, thin walls. A dozen rational explanations. I went back to my room, closed the door, got into bed, closed my eyes. The mewing started again. This time, it was not distant. It was close. It sounded like it was inside the apartment, inside the walls, inside my head. I grabbed the silicone earplugs I kept in my nightstand drawer and jammed them in, pressing them deep until the seal was tight. For a few seconds, blessed quiet. Then the sound began to build again, climbing through the barrier as though the earplugs weren't there at all. Louder, louder. A single unbroken note that seemed to vibrate in my teeth, in the roots of my molars, in the thin bones behind my eyes. I ripped the earplugs out and the full force of it hit me like a wall. I covered my ears with both hands, but it didn't matter. The sound wasn't just sound anymore. It was pressure. It was heat. It was a living thing pushing its way into my skull, and I knew with sudden, absolute certainty that if I didn't make it stop, something inside me would break. I got up. I moved through the dark hallway without my phone, without light, guided by something that wasn't quite thought. The mewing was so loud now that it had become the only thing in the world. It erased everything else. My name, my fear, the layout of the apartment I'd lived in for 3 years. There was only the sound and the overwhelming need to end it. I found the living room. I found Paul on the couch. The sound was coming from him. I know how that sounds. I know. But I crouched beside him and I could hear it. That shrill, impossible note pouring out from between his barely parted lips, like steam from a cracked pipe. His chest rose and fell with the slow rhythm of deep sleep. His eyes were closed, but his mouth emitted a sound no human throat should be capable of producing. I shook his shoulder. Nothing. I shook harder, calling his name. He didn't stir. The sound didn't waver. It was as if his body had become a vessel for something that had no intention of letting him wake up. What happened next? I've gone over it 1,000 times. In therapy, in the courtroom, in the small hours of the night when sleep refuses to come. And every time I hit the same wall. Because the truth is, I don't fully remember. I remember the sound reaching a pitch that felt like a blade being dragged across the inside of my skull. I remember my vision going white at the edges. I remember my hands moving, reaching, acting with a purpose that didn't belong to me. And then I remember silence. Perfect, sudden, total silence. I was standing in the middle of the living room. My hands were wet. Paul was no longer making any sound at all. And somewhere deep in the wreckage of my thoughts, a small, horrified voice whispered what I had done, though I couldn't bring myself to look, to confirm. Instead, I looked at the hallway, and there, in the thick darkness just beyond the edge of the living room, I saw 2 points of light, low to the ground, amber with thin vertical slits at their centers. Cat's eyes. They watched me with an intelligence that had nothing to do with animals, a cold, patient awareness, the gaze of something that had been waiting, not just tonight, but perhaps for much longer than I could fathom. My hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to pick up my phone from the couch where it had fallen. When I turned the flashlight on and aimed it down the hallway, the eyes were gone. But Derek's bedroom door, which had been closed when I passed it earlier, now stood open. I should have run. I should have gone for the front door and not looked back. But something pulled me forward. Not curiosity, not bravery. Something else. A compulsion that settled over my will like a hand pressing down on the back of my neck. I walked to Derek's room. The phone light trembled in my grip, splashing weak light across the floor. And that's when I saw them. Paw prints. Small, bloody, leading from the living room to Derek's bedroom door. The same prints I had photographed 12 hours earlier on a wall and ceiling 20 minutes across town. Derek wasn't supposed to be home. He had a night shift. But when my light reached his bed, there he was, still in his scrubs, as if he'd come home early and collapsed without a word to anyone. He lay on his back, mouth open, chest rising and falling in that same unnaturally deep rhythm I'd seen in Paul. And sitting on his chest, light as a whisper, was an orange tabby cat. The same cat. I knew it the way you know your own face in a mirror, instinctively, undeniably. The same cat from the Whitfield apartment, the same matted orange fur, the same wrongly wide mouth, the same black substance tracing a line from its lower lip. It looked at me, and I swear, on everything I have left, it smiled. Not a snarl, not a grimace, a smile. The corners of its mouth turned upward in an expression that should not exist on a feline face, an expression that radiated a malice so pure it felt almost elegant. I couldn't move. My body had locked in place, every muscle seized by a fear so fundamental it bypassed thought entirely. I stood in that doorway and watched as the cat lowered its head toward Derek's open mouth. And then, slowly, with the fluid patience of something that had done this many times before, it began to push itself inside. First the head, then the front legs folding inward, the torso compressing in ways that violated every law of anatomy I understood. The tail, last of all, sliding between Derek's lips like a rope being drawn into a hole. And then it was gone, inside him, and his mouth closed. For 2 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then Derek's eyes opened. But they were not Derek's eyes. The irises had narrowed to vertical slits, catching the flashlight with a reflective gleam. The tapetum lucidum my training supplied uselessly. The thing that makes animal eyes shine in the dark. He sat up in a way that didn't use his abdominal muscles. His torso simply rose, like a puppet pulled by a string attached to his sternum, and then his limbs began to rearrange. I heard the sounds, wet pops, grinding cracks, as his arms and legs bent at angles that dislocated joints and snapped tendons. He rolled off the bed and landed on all fours, his back arched impossibly high, his head hanging low between his shoulders. When a sound came from his throat, it was not a human sound. It was a hiss, low, building, vibrating with a resonance that made the air feel thin. And that broke the paralysis. My legs moved before my mind caught up, and I was running, down the hall, across the living room, slamming into the front door with my full weight. I grabbed the deadbolt and twisted, pulled the handle. The door didn't move. I pulled again, harder, threw my shoulder into it, kicked at the frame. Nothing. It was as if the door had fused with the wall, as if the apartment itself had decided that I was not leaving. Behind me, I heard the sound of something heavy moving across the floor on 4 points of contact. A rhythmic, uneven crawling, getting closer. I don't remember making a decision. My body made it for me. I turned, snatched a dumbbell from the rack Paul kept by the TV, and faced the hallway. The thing that had been Derek came around the corner. It moved wrong, too fast, too low to the ground, limbs bending in directions that made my eyes refuse to focus. In the thin beam of my phone's dying flashlight, I could see Derek's face, but the expression on it belonged to something else entirely. Something ancient. Something amused. It lunged. After that, it's just fragments. Impact. Sound. The wet, heavy feeling of the dumbbell connecting with something solid. A shriek that started feline and ended as nothing I can categorize. My arms swinging again and again, driven by a terror so complete that it had replaced every other function of my brain. And then, stillness. I stood over what remained, my chest heaving. My hands painted red to the wrists, the dumbbell still in my grip, though my fingers had gone so numb I could barely feel it. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes, maybe an hour. Time had become a meaningless concept, a word that no longer connected to experience. I stood in the dark, in the silence, in the aftermath of something I could not explain and could never take back. The lights came on without warning. Every light in the apartment, all at once, as if the power had never been out at all. The sudden brightness was blinding, and I threw an arm across my eyes. When I lowered it, the front door was open. Silhouettes filled the frame, the shapes resolved into police officers. 4, 5, 6 of them, pouring into the apartment with their weapons drawn, shouting commands that my ears received but my brain couldn't process. Behind them, a cluster of neighbors crowded the hallway, their faces cycling through shock, horror, and a fear that was directed entirely at me. "Drop it! Drop the weapon now!" The dumbbell left my hand. I don't think I let go so much as my fingers simply stopped working. It hit the floor with a thud that seemed to come from very far away. They pushed me against the wall. Cold hands forced my wrists together behind my back, and I felt the metal bite of handcuffs closing. Someone was reading me my rights, the words blending into a single droning hum. And then I said it. I didn't plan to. It just came out, the way air comes out when you're punched in the stomach. 3 words that rose from somewhere beneath thought, beneath reason, beneath everything I had been trained to believe about the world and how it works. The cat did it. The officer closest to me stopped, stared, then his face hardened into disgust. "You're sick," he said. "You don't understand. Please. It was the cat. The cat is in. It goes inside people. It makes them. Get him out of here." They dragged me toward the door, and as they pulled me through the living room, past the wreckage and the evidence and the shapes on the floor I couldn't let myself look at, my eyes drifted to the far corner of the room, near the overturned side table. An orange tabby cat lay curled on the carpet, mouth open wide, too wide, with that same black, viscous substance pooling beneath its jaw. Its body was still, lifeless. But as the officers hauled me past, I saw it. The pupils contracted, a slow, deliberate narrowing, not a post-mortem reflex, not a trick of the light, a conscious, purposeful adjustment, the movement of something that was watching, assessing, choosing. I screamed. I fought against the handcuffs and the hands holding me, thrashing toward the cat, trying to make them see, make them understand. But they just gripped harder and pulled faster, and the last thing I saw before they forced me through the door was that dead orange cat lying perfectly still in its corner, dead, except for the eyes that followed me out. That was 11 months ago. I'm writing this from a facility where the windows don't open and the lights never fully turn off. My lawyer says the trial isn't going well. The prosecution has my fingerprints on the dumbbell, my DNA mixed with the blood, and 2 dead men in an apartment with only 1 living person inside. My therapist says I've made progress, but her eyes say something different. They say she's charting my delusions, cataloging my fixations, building a picture of a man who snapped under the pressures of a gruesome career and destroyed 2 innocent lives. Maybe she's right. That's the worst part. I can't be sure she isn't. The other patients here have their own horrors, their own impossible stories, and sometimes late at night, when the ward is quiet and the fluorescent lights hum their endless lullaby, I wonder how many of them are telling the truth, and how many of them wonder the same thing about themselves. I've accepted that no one will believe me. How could they? I was found standing over 2 bodies with a murder weapon in my hands, saying the same impossible thing that girl in the Whitfield apartment said. The same words. The same desperate, useless words. But here's the thing that keeps me awake. The thing that makes me press my back against the wall when the lights dim at night and stare at the gap beneath my door. Last week, one of the orderlies mentioned in passing that a new patient was being transferred in. A man from a town about 60 miles north, found in his living room, they said. 2 dead roommates. No coherent explanation. He keeps saying an animal made him do it. And 2 nights ago, just past 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound I recognized instantly. A sound I will recognize for as long as I live. A single, sustained, high-pitched mewing. Distant. Threading through the walls of this locked ward like a needle through cloth. It's here, and it's choosing.